must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Moeller, a writer and meditation teacher here in Washington, D.C., and welcome to another episode of Meditation for the Masses. As always, I'm here to take meditation out of the faraway monasteries, expensive retreat centers in corporate America, and bring it to the things that matter the most to working people. That would be work, relationships, and politics. I like to call it mindfulness for the hustle and the class struggle. This episode is actually about the hustle, that lingering sense that we always need to be working, checking social media, adding to our resume, checking our email, going back to school, driving Uber, just always grinding and making money, and why that feeling isn't healthy and not even necessarily productive. Before I get into it, just another reminder, as always, to rate the show if you like it. That's going to help me show up in Apple Podcasts and all the other apps that people listen to podcasts on, and stick around to the end where I mention a little bit more about my writing on meditation and politics, as well as my teaching. Thank you for listening. We Americans are a hardworking bunch. On average, we work more hours, we take less vacation, and retire later than people in any other country in the world. We're number one in work. And that's just the formal work, where we work a job and we get paid in a paycheck from a company. There's also all the time that we all know we spend watching TV and vegging out on Facebook and other forms of social media, which might feel like relaxation, but it's actually pretty hard on the brain, especially all those ads that we're consuming. And those are actually producing value for Facebook, Twitter, CNN, etc., all at our expense. They are selling our attention to these advertisers. So in a sense, we're actually working while we're trying to veg out and relax. And why do we work so hard? It's not because we're special here, America. It's not because of any of that stuff. It's because of the way that our society is organized, and that is capitalism. Capitalism forces those of us not lucky enough to be born into wealth to spend more time working for a living than actually enjoying our living. So we have to sell our labor. We have to sell our labor power and our time to other people in order to make money to then go buy food, shelter, and all the things we need. And this was not the way that human society was organized as of about 300 or 400 years ago. So what I'm getting at is that the vast majority of us actually have no choice but to hustle. We got to hustle for that dollar. And the United States is the quintessential capitalist nation. We didn't invent capitalism, of course, that would be Britain. But because of all the land we stole from the Native Americans and all the labor we stole and the lives we stole from African slaves, we essentially perfected capitalism and became the strongest capitalist nation in the world, and remained that way today. So forget about what the Republican Party and folks like former or soon-to-be former Representative Paul Ryan say about folks that are struggling to pay the bills or just can't keep a job, that they must be lazy and they don't want to work. Of course, there may be a handful of those types of people. But regardless, Americans work really hard, and we are, in general, a striving bunch of folks. So it makes sense that in American meditation circles, where Buddhism is often a big influence on teachers and the way we talk about meditation, the teachings about the historical Buddha, so the actual person, the guy, the Indian guy, to about 2,500 years ago, who folks eventually called the Buddha, the teachings about the Buddha in American meditation circles often solely focus on one chapter of his life, and this is the beginning of his life. And if you aren't familiar with Buddhism, you might have heard this story, you might not have. Obviously, he's not as famous as someone like Jesus in the United States. And quick side note, this isn't a Buddhist podcast per se. However, there are many lessons from Buddhism that have shaped my personal meditation practice and how I teach. So I'll occasionally talk about lessons from Buddhism, but always trying to make them applicable to our lives right here, right now in modern society. And this story about the Buddha, this origin story per se, that gets repeated a lot, it is one of those stories that's important. So as the story goes, the Buddha, I think, was 29 years old in the story. He actually stepped outside of his family's palace for the first time at 29 years old. He lived a very sheltered life, apparently. Before that, his father, who was a rich, noble merchant, I think, someone that was politically connected in his particular city and town, or town, wherever he was, wanted to keep him sheltered. So he didn't leave his palace until he was 29 years old. He encountered 4 people as soon as he stepped out. And the first person he encountered was a sick person. The second one was an extremely old person that was just struggling to stay upright. The next person he came across was a dead person, just a body lying there in the street. And, having grown up in a palace in this sort of wealthy environment, he hadn't seen that sort of suffering firsthand. And he was blown away by that suffering and really hurt by it. And then the fourth person he saw was a monk. And this person was living a very different lifestyle than what he had been living, surrounded by all this wealthy opulence. And this monk just had, a simply shaved head, like a simple sort of robe, and was begging for food. And he was really struck by this. So these encounters with these 4 people, and particularly that monk at the end, so the story goes, so awakened him and just kind of snapped him out of his prior lifestyle that he decided to leave that lifestyle for good and actually pursue the path of becoming a monk and try to find enlightenment. And then, eventually he did, and he became the Buddha. So the reason why this story is told a lot and why it does resonate with a lot of folks, particularly in American meditation circles, is because it was this heroic search for meaning. He was blown away by the suffering, and then he saw a path, this monk, this way of living that could give him some meaning and awaken him in life to understand why people have to suffer through all these things, through old age, through sickness, and through death. And I think it resonates with us, particularly that live in a very capitalist society, because it motivates us to deepen our own search. And this fits right in with the so-called American dream, right? Suffering is all there is, as the Buddha saw, so we better, grit our teeth and just get to work and keep grinding. And one day, if we just have enough money, enough time, enough love, enough, in the Buddhist case, mindfulness, or whatever we're searching for, whatever we feel we need to finally feel the way we want to feel, maybe we'll finally feel fulfilled, right? So it's this heroic search, and I think that aspect, that origin story of the Buddha's life resonates with a lot of folks, and it makes sense. But what often gets left out is actually the next phase of that story, the next chapter. And what I'm going to try to get across in this podcast is that I think it's just as important as that first bit, that first chapter, and maybe even more important, particularly here in the US. And maybe I would go as far as saying that we shouldn't tell that first chapter of the Buddha's life without this second chapter. Because just on itself, it sort of doubles down on that American dream, sort of overworked sense that many of us feel. So the next chapter goes like this. For the next 6 years after coming across those four people and after he left his palace, the Buddha wandered forests and jungles. He, again, wasn't the Buddha yet, but who became the Buddha, wandered around in forests and jungles in that area of India. And he decided to practice, as a monk, practice intense forms of meditation and very austere living. So eating very little and just practicing all day and even through the night as much as he could. And this was 6 years of this sort of practice. So, he tortured his body to try to, and this is sort of the way the story goes, he tortured his body to try to overcome its desires and needs. And eventually he got to limiting his diet to a few grains of rice a day. And not even, I don't believe any water, just a few grains of rice. And again, remember that this is a story about an actual person, but there's also sort of a mythic quality to it, a fantasy quality, because it's been passed down through the years and likely been exaggerated. But he said later about this period of his life that when I touched my belly, I would feel my backbone, and when I went to urinate, I would fall over. So he was in pretty bad shape. And it got so bad that he felt like he was about to die, and he just couldn't move. He was laying there in this kind of random place in a forest, this remote jungle. And he realized in that moment that starving himself was actually only causing more suffering. That, the whole point of going down this path of spirituality and trying to become a monk was to lessen his suffering. But here he was starving himself and trying to avoid and kind of ignore the desires of his own body and his own self. And that was only causing him to suffer more. And certainly wasn't enlightenment, because he was about to die. So at that moment, as the story goes, a peasant woman was passing by, just kind of randomly, coincidentally, luckily, and gave him a milk rice, which whatever that is, I don't know what that is, and over time he recovered. So I guess she nursed him and took care of him for a while. And then he would go on to develop the practices and teachings that would soon become known as Buddhism. And Buddhism is sometimes described as the middle way. Somewhere between that sort of striving, starving quality, that path that he tried for six years, and then on the other end, just kind of letting go and like, just eating a ton and kind of the life that he had been living before, this opulent, wealthy lifestyle, this middle way in between. So I want to highlight two major takeaways from this part of the story, part of his life, and these are the two lessons. One is striving for perfection, even in spiritual practice, is yet another form of grasping. And this grasping onto things, onto feelings, onto having, situations go in a particular way, that is literally the cause of our suffering. And then the second lesson is we can't do it all alone. We can't make it in this world by ourselves. And so first, on that first lesson, why do we strive, right? Again, we live in a capitalist society, so we have to hustle, right? But many have developed a tendency to hustle and strive for perfection based on our own experience, our own individual experience. And we sort of lean into the future. We plan, we fantasize, and we worry about what's going to happen in the future. And which, obviously planning is important. We should think about what's going to happen tomorrow or later in the week. We should have a calendar to keep track of what's going to happen. But if we spend a lot of time obsessing about it, we all know that can be a pretty tough time. And it can bring up some emotions and worries about what's going to happen. And a lot of times it's not even useful, right? So like I spend a lot of time when I have like a tough conversation with somebody, maybe I need to talk to my boss and ask for a raise, or maybe I need to talk to a roommate of mine, or if I'm in a relationship, in the past I've had trouble bringing up tough subjects with my girlfriend. And I'll spend a lot of times beforehand not actually thinking about what I really want to say, but I'm sort of like playing out the conversation in my head and worrying about, what is the right way to say it? What is she going to say? Is she going to worry about, or is she going to judge me if I say this? And it just like goes on and on and on and on. And obviously that's not planning in a useful way. And all of this sort of leaning into the future, as we could call it, or the striving, it takes us out of the present moment and it numbs us to our bodies and our emotions. And feeling things directly is difficult, especially if we've experienced severe trauma. So we develop habits and patterns at an early age to protect ourselves from having to feel intense emotions and caused by people we have no control over. And striving is just one of those patterns. It's a way of convincing ourselves that we're working very hard to end our suffering, that we're doing something about it, say to lose 50 pounds or writing a novel, reach whatever our goals are. And we all have a lot of goals. But it's actually how we've been conditioned, again, by our experiences early on, but also living in a capitalist society, to dodge the hardest but most rewarding work of all, which is staying engaged, staying in touch with what we're feeling, and what others are feeling around us, right here, right now. And luckily, the Buddha taught a practice to go along with this idea, or his theory of human suffering, that it's all about grasping, and that is meditation. Meditation calms our mind and produces what folks call mindfulness, which helps us notice these patterns like striving when we're trying to escape the present moment. And then over time, with more practice of meditation, it helps us feel compassion rather than resentment towards those patterns or towards ourselves for the way we act out, whether that's striving, planning, worrying, feeling anxiety, having a drink at the bar or downing a few beers because we feel anxiety. And it helps us change. When we have that compassion for ourselves, it helps us change the way we relate to whatever is happening within us and our emotions right here, right now, but also what's going on around us. And to whatever our patterns are and whatever's happening around us. And then finally, that second lesson. So, as I said, we can't do it all alone, right? And, the Buddha he was lucky that a peasant woman was walking by. He would have died trying had it not been for her. And this was a peasant woman living in an extremely patriarchal society at that time. So, that's another interesting aspect to the story. But pretending we can do it all on our own is yet another way we've been conditioned in a capitalist society. And this time it's in order to justify or preserve a particular social order, right? To keep particular people on top and keep most other people on the bottom. So if you think about it, we worship people like Elon Musk or Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, this kind of startup entrepreneur who just kind of made themselves in the world. We also, worship the one kid that made it out of a poor neighborhood, or the underdog politician. And I saw this ad earlier in the gym that had this blonde, white woman, traditionally beautiful female figure, younger woman. She was skinny, but she was also curvy. And it said, #I made this. And it's like, I was thinking, well, actually, no, her parents made her, right? Particularly anything with her body. But also, didn't society also define, her particular look as a beautiful thing, as beauty itself? But we always want to tell ourselves, and this is just kind of an aspect of our society, that we accomplished the success that we've accomplished, that we didn't need anyone else. And I've always thought for a long time that, America in particular is a lonely, individualistic place because of that sense. But, as the Buddhist story shows, we need other people. We can't do all this by ourselves. He would have died trying to find himself and find enlightenment had it not been for this peasant woman. Not even some special heroic figure, although I would argue that she is a hero. So, those are the two lessons. To summarize, suffering is when we're grasping onto reality being a certain way, or that we are a certain way, and when we are resisting what actually is happening. And so striving particularly hard, particularly striving for perfection, is only adding to our suffering. But it's okay. We've been conditioned that way by our particular society, and many of us grew up in households around adults that also pushed us to strive for perfection, just sort of in the DNA of our society. So we just got to continue to work at it. And then the second thing is we can't do it alone. As much as we have these big national narratives, these myths about, I can do this by myself, I can bootstrap, I can pick myself up by my bootstraps, I can be the entrepreneur, I can be the innovator. And as much as we have those stories, literally we can't do it alone. We need each other. And so with that, I'm going to get out of here and let you go. If you stick around for a second, you'll hear a little bit about my writing, a little bit about where to find more information about me, and have a good one. A few things before you get on with your day. Make sure you're subscribed to Meditation for the Masses on iTunes or whatever app you use for podcasts. That's so you won't miss an episode. If you want more from me, sign up for my weekly email on meditation at jeremymoeller.blog/signup. My website also has free recordings of guided meditations and when and where I teach meditation in person. I generally teach in the Washington, D.C. area, but hope to expand my reach in the near future. And finally, please rate this episode on whatever app you use to listen to it. You might not realize how important that is. I spent years loving podcasts like The Tim Ferriss Show and The Dig without ever actually rating them, even though their host would ask me to rate them on every episode. Ratings make podcast apps recommend Meditation for the Masses to folks looking for podcasts on meditation. So it's really important to me. I deeply appreciate you listening. Thank you.